We're going to start here in just a minute.
Just a couple. There's some seats all up in here. Okay. Once these guys sit.
Great.
Okay.
Hi, all. Thanks for coming. My name is David Verba, and I'm the Director of Technology for Adaptive Path. And I have a long history and background in development, but most recently, I came to Adaptive Path as technical lead for MeasureMap, which was a statistics reporting tool for bloggers that we developed internally and sold to Google earlier this year.
And I'm Sarah Nelson. I'm a design strategist at Adaptive Path. And I come from a front-end development background, but I've been a creative director and built user experience groups. I have a real strong belief that designers need to have a sort of a sensibility about development, and likewise, developers can have a sensibility about design, and those two things together can make a really sort of powerful combination. And so that's really the focus of our talk today. For those of you who are not familiar with Adaptive Path is a user experience consulting firm based in San Francisco. You might be familiar with Jesse James Garrett, who's giving a keynote tomorrow. Highly recommend you check it out. He's, amongst many other things, he's sort of best known for coining the term Ajax as a way of explaining the concept to some of our clients.
And we're here because I've seen a clear trend over the last several years with the arrival of Ajax on the scene and new application frameworks, most notably Ruby on Rails, and just the rise in popularity of more iterative development processes that people in traditional roles of developers and designers are working more closely together than ever before. But also, people I know who are developers oftentimes find themselves coming up face-to-face with design tasks or tasks that feel to them like design tasks, and they feel a little bit out of their depth or out of their area of expertise. And a couple of months ago, I read this article in a design magazine by a designer named David Womack, who was hanging out on a roof with a Flash developer friend of his, and they were watching this flight of birds. And the Flash developer was describing how he had to make the bodies, he had to model the flock of the flight of these birds, and the bodies had to move up and down with each stroke of the wings, and they had to get smaller as they got further away, and they had to approach the horizon. And David Womack realized that he had, as a designer, he had looked at flocks of birds forever, but had never kind of perceived these minor details. But once he had them pointed out to him, that he was able to perceive it whenever he looked at a flock of birds. And I think this happens both ways with developers and designers, that oftentimes we're on the same page, but that sometimes we have to have things pointed out to us or have a language given to us to be able to discuss the issues that come up. So to that end, in this session, we're going to present a broad survey of design principles as it applies to many layers of websites. And the core of this will be a framework for understanding design practice as it applies to web applications. And along the way, we'll provide a language for communicating clearly about design, and that's whether you need to communicate with designers that you work with, whether you're designers yourselves, or whether you're kind of stuck in a room by yourself trying to think about these issues. And of course, this is a broad topic. We can't cover it exhaustively in an hour. So along the way, we'll point to resources for further learning.
Great. So why talk about design? Is design the new black? I like dressing in black, but so the business community has recently really kind of taken the idea of design to heart, mainly based on the possibility of increasing the desirability of products and therefore their, by extension, their potential for success in the marketplace. But being the new black has some kind of slightly negative connotations, and it sort of implies a little bit of snake oil. So there's some skepticism around sort of the ability of it to really actually affect that desirability of products. But really, the field of design has a lot of useful tools that can improve the customer experience, not just on an aesthetic level, which is where it's typically thought of as having the most impact, but throughout many levels of the customer experience. And one of the main reasons that the business community has become so kind of excited about it is this product, which is the ubiquitous iPod, iTunes Music Store example. But it's actually a really interesting case because It addresses the idea of design on many, many levels. It has a compelling visual design, so it sort of has an emotional connection that people make. It has a good interaction format. It tends to model the way that you interact. It tends to model the way that you interact with media in a way that people understand. It has a good information design, but it also has a complete experience that includes both the device, a desktop application, and the music store. And one of the keys here is that a successful product really depends on the experience your users have with your product and how well it serves their needs. A holistic design sensibility can really support this. Designers have this whole host of tools and techniques that you can use to dramatically improve the desirability of your products.
And we're going to start off with a really quick run-through of an example of a web application. This one particular school district, part of their teachers' responsibilities was a self-assessment or periodic list of questions that the teachers had to answer to evaluate their performance in the classroom. In this particular school district, they had a desktop application that the teachers were supposed to use to do this. And they were having problems with teacher compliance and just uptake on the application. So they decided they were going to move it to a web-based application. And the original desktop application was a very blank screen. There was some printed documentation that came with it, and there were some menus across the top. Teachers were kind of left in the lurch. They were familiar enough with desktop applications, they could click around in menus and figure out what to do. So the original brief was to translate this to the web. So one potential way to go about it would be to do just a straight literal translation to the web, where basically all the menus turn into drop-down boxes. This is a horrible implementation of a less than ideal desktop application to begin with. You know, teachers coming to this, they really have no clue what to do next, and clicking around on boxes is not as effective here. So a more reasonable solution would be something like this, where you come to a home page, there's some explanatory text, there's some instructions, there's a clear getting started button. If they click on getting started, it takes them to the first question. It guides them. They can either go to the next question, they can go back and review the answers that they've done already. This is a much, much better solution because as long as the teacher knows there's a process, if they come to the site, it can really guide them through the whole step. And this actually seems like a really good solution. The only problem is you go back and you talk to the teachers and you discover that the teachers are with their kids all day long. And really, at most, they have 5 or 10 minutes during the course of the day. And this self-evaluation, you could rush through it in a couple of hours, but to give it any kind of depth of thought takes 3 or 4 hours. And it's obvious that there's no 3 or 4 hour stretch of time that the teachers have access to during the course of their work week. So really, you actually have to go back and redesign the whole application. If you're going to do this a couple years ago, you would have done something like this, where you maintain session state across multiple visits. A teacher comes back, they see their progress during the current cycle of self-evaluation. They can continue, they can review their process. Another option, developed maybe more recently, you could do it with Ajax, have everything on one page, the complete list of questions with a clear indication of whether it's completed or not, and once again, the indicator of how far along in the process they are. The final twist to this is, of course, during the course of development, even though the original brief was just to translate this desktop application to a web-based application, turns out there was all these reporting requirements that the results had to go up to the principals, actually had to go up to the superintendents, but because of union regulations and privacy issues, there was certain specific information they were not allowed to see. Which brings us kind of to the takeaways of this example, which is, one, it's really important to know your users. The original brief, once again, was just to translate this web application, this desktop application to a web application, and really the teachers were understood as the only set of users. But it's really important to actually dig around because sometimes there's other parties of users that you have to take into account when you're designing your application. But the other thing that's really important is it wasn't enough to know just that the users were teachers. We really had to understand the limitations that the teachers were going to face when they came to our site. We had to understand their context, their motivations, and their challenges when they were using our application. And the final thing to note is we did the diagrams intentionally in low fidelity because none of the design issues we were talking about here were visual design issues. They were all issues of function and the teacher's interactions with the site. And this is actually an area where developers traditionally actually have a lot of input, and these are areas that we feel are clearly design issues.
So we're going to actually go into a little bit more detail about how sort of these multiple levels of design work, and we're going to use this framework that was developed by Jesse James Garrett called the Elements of User Experience. And he developed, it's actually a really useful framework for understanding and kind of putting into nice buckets the way sort of all of the different types of thought and practice that goes into creating a successful user experience. And it goes beyond the typical view of design and user experience as sort of a surface-oriented discipline and looks at the way it's constructed, all levels. And it includes both strategy, structure, and surface. So let's sort of look at this framework a little bit. There are 5 main elements, and they're arranged from sort of concrete elements like the actual thing that you interact with, all the way to more abstract elements like the strategy, plans, thoughts, and ideas behind the site. So at the top of the framework is the idea of surface. And surface is what will the finished product look like? So at this point, you're thinking about things like visual design, graphic design, images. You might be thinking about tone of copy, labels, and things like that. The skeleton level is what components will enable people to actually use this site. And this is sort of typically where wireframes happen. This is sort of all the pieces that are on a page, how they're organized, and how people interact directly with those elements. The structure of the site is sort of how all of those pieces fit together. So this includes things like the information architecture of the site, how content relates to each other, interaction design, how people move through the site. And then the scope is sort of what features will be included and how the site will actually, sort of the big picture of what will be in the site. And then finally, strategy is where you think about both what do we want to get out of the site and what do our users want to get out of the site. So I'm going to go into each one of these elements in a little bit more detail. So one way to think about strategy is that it's critical to identify and articulate both what you want to get out of the site and what your users want or need from your product. And the intersection of your goals and your users' needs is really your strategic sweet spot. You can build both a successful strategy by clearly articulating your goals, identifying and knowing your customer really well, and developing a set of offerings that will meet both of these needs. So let's sort of first talk about stakeholders. It's really important to, actually I'm going to step back for a second. Let's actually talk about goals. Defining goals can actually be really tricky, and I think most of you are well aware of this, that people have lots of opinions, especially when you're working in a large group, of what the goals of a site might be. And it's important for developers and designers to be able to sift through those goals and come up with something that's quite actionable that they can actually work from. And one way that you can begin to really articulate the goals is to know your stakeholders. So what do I mean by stakeholders? I specifically mean that a stakeholder is anyone who has an interest in the outcome of a project. So it could be sort of the obvious things if you're in a large organization. These are CEOs and COOs and CFOs and product managers. But on a small team, it could be as simple as you and your friends. The important thing here is that you need to identify all of your project stakeholders, and sometimes they exist in places that you might not have thought of. So sort of brainstorming around that and identifying them is important. But then you need to actually go on and help them articulate their objectives for the project. And a lot of times this does actually fall into your camp a little bit. So one way to think about the goals is to actually get more specific and discuss them as site objectives. And site objectives are an explicit declaration of the project's goals and desired outcomes. So sometimes it can be actually really, really difficult to specifically articulate what these are. But it's critical that the site objectives are actually specific and actionable. So sometimes you might, and I've definitely seen this, you might get a site objective that's really too broad. It might be something like, I want this to be the best seller of everything to everybody ever, which is not actually that far off of the kinds of site objectives you sometimes get. But it's not something you can really design to. And you need to work with them to get as specific as possible. So what I have here is an example of a more specific site objective. So this is on the left-hand side, we have sort of the old model for a site. And it was a site that was based on lead generation. The primary revenue model was lead generation. And in the future, this company wants to actually shift its emphasis to more of an ad-based model. So this is starting to become something that is more directly actionable. And it starts to suggest things that designers and developers can do. So it starts to make you think about, might you be recommending the repositioning of ads or reformatting or completely rethinking an ad strategy? Or might you be also begin to ask questions of your stakeholders. How does the relationship of the content of your site interface with the ads? And what does that user experience look like? But I think one of the things that's also really important to understand about the site objectives is that there are the sort of user-facing site objectives, but there's also the internal-facing site objectives. And that sometimes the things that you do to the external site dramatically impact the internal operations. And that it's really important that you think sort of systematically about the kinds of ways that you design a site and try to build a holistic picture so you can really understand the full impact of the kinds of decisions that you're making. Which really brings us to the users, who are the sort of the front end. So there are, without a doubt, multiple user types to your site. They might be internal, but they might be external. And then within the external, they might sort of divide into different types of users. So I like to pick on Jesse a little bit, but when you start thinking about who your users are, you have to ask yourself how to identify them. And sometimes you already know this. Sometimes you might have a sense. Sometimes it might require that you do some research and dig into it. And sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel because people in your organization have started to think about who might the market for this site be. But often what you'll typically get is something that looks like this, sort of a demographic profile of your user group. And so when you look at a demographic profile like this, what does it really actually tell us about this person? Not, in my opinion, a heck of a lot. It's very sort of descriptive. He's a white male, he's 25 to 40, lives in a city, he's a computer professional. But what kinds of interface decisions and choices can you actually make based on this type of information? And it can be a really good starting point, but it doesn't really get you to something that you can really do. So as sort of David was talking about, what's really important is that you need to actually get out and talk with your users and get out from your own environment and go into their spaces and understand how they work, look at the kind of computers that they're using, and actually get a real visceral understanding of their behaviors and their motivations. It's really good to do this before you start designing so that you have a real good picture. I think there's a session later about persona development and kind of get a good idea of who your users are, and it can help you figure out what you're making. But you can also do this kind of talking at various stages of the project. So you might design something and then test it more in sort of the usability area, or you can sort of present things in little iterations and see how well what you're thinking about is working. And one really good sort of example of this is it's critical that you understand, even if you are your user, that you are not necessarily your user. So this is MeasureMap, which is a product that Adaptive Path designed. It's a tool for bloggers that sort of helps them understand the visitation and sort of other kinds of data about their blog. And it was designed and developed by a number of people who were themselves bloggers and who were very comfortable with the space. But what they knew is that you kind of get in your own little bubble, and it can be hard to really get some perspective. And so they developed an alpha testing program where they invited many bloggers to come and use their product on an ongoing basis while they're developing it, and then give feedback. And it really sort of informed the development of the product and made some real impacts on the choices that were made. This is one resource, though. So the observing the user experience, there are so many ways that you can actually do this. And we're not going to really talk about them here, but this is a really excellent resource. There are very few resources actually really about this, but by Mike Kuniowski, and it outlines all kinds of ways you can go about learning and talking to your users, from diaries and video ethnography and sort of various other kinds of usability testing and things. So I highly recommend that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about kind of going back to the business goals and user needs, how you can actually really bring these together into a strategy that can make you more competitive in the marketplace and sort of differentiate yourself. We're going to talk a little bit about Flickr. So Flickr, I imagine most people in the audience are familiar with Flickr, so I won't describe it too much. But we actually don't really know how their strategy works, so this is kind of a hypothetical, but it's an interesting exercise. So what we're looking at is, on this chart, on the left-hand side, way over here, or actually along the bottom, we have these 6 steps that we can identify about the way that people use and share photos online, sort of digital photos. They upload them, they store, view them, edit, share, printing. This kind of comes out of an understanding of how, just sort of looking at how people use photos. So what Flickr might have done is looked across the competitive landscape at some of their sort of main competitors, Snapfish, Kodak, and CVS, and looked at the kinds of ways that they're satisfying user needs. And so one thing you can see right away is that there's this big group of them all together right up in printing. So actually the vertical axis is the degree to which something, a user action is satisfied. So they're all kind of glommed up here around printing. So one way that Flickr could have looked at this and said, these guys are doing everything with printing, we should do everything with printing, we should do this exact same feature. But really what Flickr did was something sort of different. They looked at what they knew about how users actually, their particular crowd of users were thinking about photos, that they knew that their friends weren't printing out the photos and mailing them to each other, they were emailing them or looking for ways to share them. So instead of going where everyone else was going, they actually didn't do anything with printing for a long time. They focused on the sharing portion. And so this is a way that you can see that it allows them to stand out in the marketplace while satisfying the actual way that people use information.
And the next layer is scope, and that's what features will the site need to include. And as we saw with Flickr, you should be able to draw a clear line from the strategy to the list of these features. And these usually come across your desk as a functional spec, and this can be a list of features on a napkin, or hopefully you don't see too many of these documents. They can come across your desk as 100 pages of detailed user use cases and functional specs covering like every aspect of the site. And but the important thing to remember is don't try to be everything to everybody. And the folks at 37 Signals argue very articulately for developing applications, not getting lost in the feature competitiveness, and developing applications that have a really reduced feature set and get them to market quickly. But as developers, oftentimes we don't necessarily have that privilege. Sometimes for strategic reasons, we really do have to have a broad range of features. Wells Fargo can't launch an online banking application that only handles checking accounts and doesn't handle savings accounts. And oftentimes, you find yourself in a situation where you have this huge list of features, and it's obvious that you can't develop all those features for your initial product launch. And I've been in rooms where we kind of sit around and we rate all the features on a scale of 1 to 10 on desirability and difficulty to implement. We toss it in this evaluation pool, and we come out with this list of features that we're going to launch with, or other equally kind of ad hoc methods that come up with these lists of features. And those processes help you feel like you're doing something rational, but oftentimes what you end up with is a list of features that doesn't make any sense as a congruent whole. And a better approach is to actually, once again, go back to your users. Take your users as a lens to view your features through, and to decide who your initial set of users are going to be that you want to attract to your site, or the initial set of users that you want to serve with your site. And using that set of users, develop a core set of features that are going to give them a complete experience. And once you launch with that core set of features, after that happens, then you can go ahead and extend that set of features and extend the functionality to give them a much richer experience. And then subsequent to that, then you can really expand out with the other features that are filling in on the gaps and bring in a larger set of users. But along the way, while you're doing this, pay attention to your user feedback, because none of the decisions you make at an earlier stage are written in stone. You really can come back and change some of this stuff on the fly. So the important thing here is to make a promise to your users and deliver on it. But the other thing to keep in mind is, depending on your application, you may belong to an ecosystem of applications. There's a whole host of applications out there, Flickr photo uploaders, Flickr taggers, Flickr photo editors, that all exist in a world where it is assumed that Flickr exists. And sometimes somebody else has solved part of the problem that you're trying to solve, so you don't have to solve the whole problem. You can take advantage of what they've already done. And additionally, you can turn this around yourself. You can open up a public API, and obviously you have to think about how you implement that, but you can open up a public API to your users, and then you allow your users, your passionate users, to develop applications on top of yours. And that allows them to implement features that either you don't have the time to implement or that you haven't even thought of.
Okay, so moving down in the framework, look at structure. This is really how will the pieces of the site fit together. So to look at this a little bit, we're actually, the way I'm going to focus on this section is to look at two kind of key sub-design disciplines that exist. And the first one is interaction design, and the other one is information architecture. And I'm a little intimidated to talk about information architecture because Kiara Fox is sitting here, and she's an information architecture monster. So she'll have to tell me later how I do. So we're going to look at some basic principles, and we're going to start with interaction design. So interaction design at this level, I'm talking, so there's actually interaction design what happens at the skeleton level too, but here it's really looking about how the user moves through processes from one step to another. So the way that I think about interaction design at this level, it's like designing some kind of an emergent system where you're setting up a series of guidelines and rules that will help you as you kind of begin to kind of frame the site as you go along. So at the outset of the project, one way to think about developing your sort of interaction strategy is to use what Alan Cooper calls interaction frameworks. So the interaction frameworks include sort of the major rules of interaction and the general principles that you use while making decisions about design of the site. So for instance, if you're designing a shopping cart, will you be using a more sort of traditional page-based pipeline, or maybe doing something more responsive like a drag and drop sort of shopping cart? That kind of model sort of will affect all kinds of choices that you make all the way through it. And if you look at it in more detail, you'll be doing things like identifying, is this sort of a page-based? Are most of the interactions on the site page-based? Might some of them include some kind of pop-up windows? Or might they include some kind of layers that are happening within the site? One of the key things here is that developers can provide a lot of insight for interaction designers at this stage. And that a lot of times interaction designers are making these kinds of decisions without maybe fully knowing the technical constraints in which they're working. And it's really critical to try to find ways to make a dialogue here, because there's sort of two things that can happen. Is that one, that the interaction designers will be too conservative and will go for the thing that they know works without really knowing sort of the possibilities that exist. The other side is that they'll make all kinds of decisions that you can't actually do, and they'll design these things and make hundreds of wireframes, and then later on you have to reel them back in, which can be frustrating and inefficient for everyone. So I think this is a really good point, a good place to try to figure out how to collaborate more strongly with interaction designers. Another way to think about approaching the design of this phase is to start thinking about ways that you can think of modular elements to the site. So this is kind of, I think that the thinking here is like, in some ways, like object-oriented programming, and that you're thinking about reusable pieces that you can kind of make and use repeatedly through the site. So I have a really unusable and abstract example, but we have some kind of data that you can kind of fill with, some kind of little data widget, and it might get used on the site as like a little small kind of side widget, or something that's really central to an interaction, or something that is sort of part of another interaction. And that you sort of look for ways to make these reusable pieces and put them all over. And it can make for both a really consistent user experience, because people learn the model that you've set up and then they see it repeated. But it can also be a really highly efficient way both to design and develop a site. So if you're interested in really kind of diving more into to interaction design, I recommend this book. If you haven't seen it, About Face, The Essentials of Interaction Design by Alan Cooper. This is a really good reference, and he's actually very good at sort of systematically providing some protocols for developing things like interaction frameworks. So let's look at the second subdiscipline, which is information architecture. And this is really a lot more about content. And how users move from one content element to the next, how content is organized and structured, and sort of the model by which content is developed. I don't know if any of you saw Chiara's thing this morning that was about sort of understanding the content you have and learning to kind of look at patterns and relationships that exist in that content. I liked it. It was a good talk. So I actually have a few principles about information architecture that are just sort of very high-level ones to think about as you're structuring information. And the first one is the principle of granularity. So the idea of granularity is that you want to have and develop a hierarchy of information where all the content groups have a parity. And what you're trying to do is help people who are visiting your site understand the way in which you've organized your content, and you want to try to match that content to the mental models that they may have about that content. So I'm going to give a really specific and simple example. I'm going to take four content or four sort of ideas or elements. So we have an apple, a pear, a banana, and fruit. And if you play the one of these things is not like the others game, there's a pretty quick, association that fruit is not exactly the same as apple, pear, or banana. And that's because obviously apple, pear, and banana are a type of fruit, and so there's a sort of different level of granularity that exists here. And so you would sort of start to parse out this hierarchy. And you can think about presenting the information this way, where you do something where you visually emphasize that there's a hierarchy. So fruit is the top of the level, and then apple, pear, banana. But the important thing, so other sort of sections you might have, let's say you had a bunch of vegetables, you might have Fruit and vegetables would be at the same level of granularity. And then the apple, sort of pears and bananas, are at their own level of granularity. So the second principle is labeling. And labeling is actually really important and is one of the areas that sites tend to fall down on over time. So what's really important is that you design your labels with audiences in mind. And you think really a lot about the language in which they're thinking and the sort of the way that they understand concepts that you're bringing across. So one example is a very, very simple example is, let's say that someone from the Human Resources Department has come and asked you to post some employment opportunities on the website. And you sort of think about how might I actually label this. So this is a consumer-facing website. It's some kind of employment listings area. This is ubiquitous. But you could label it as human resources because that's the department that brought it to you. But that's sort of an internal organizational way of thinking about that label. You could also label employment opportunities because that's what you guys all call it internally, and that's it describes what it is. Steve Krug talks about in his The Don't Make Me Think book, he talks about not sort of forcing users to do a lot of translation and going for the simplest label that you can get, which could be in this case jobs. And so it's a short word, and it's a very specific meaning. And we see this all through the web because it is a very sort of simple, easy to understand label. If you were actually designing this for an intranet, you might actually call it the Human Resources Department because then you're speaking to an internal audience who thinks about job opportunities come out of human resources. Perhaps if that's the way your organization is structured. So it's important to just kind of think about who your audience is, and as you're thinking about labeling. Hello. Okay, and then okay, there was this video. There was this video running around the internet of this professor who went and picked up the phone that some student was ringing, and he smashed it. Nobody's seen it. Okay. All right. So consistency. So this last bit is about consistency and the idea that once you've come up with a labeling system, it's really important to keep the integrity of that labeling system going over time. And Chiara talked a lot about content, the process of content audit, where you do a high-level survey of your site and you try to understand how well your information architecture has held up over time. So when we do content audits, this is something we find a lot of the time, which is that there might be many labels that have kind of proliferated throughout the site for exactly the same piece of content. So about us, about our company, this company, who we are, who are we? The important thing here is to just kind of pick a labeling structure, stick with it, and then maintain it over time. So if you're interested in information architecture, this is the book. I think I heard there's a third edition coming out, or it's already out. It gets thicker every single time it does, but this is definitely a really great resource.
And the next level is the skeleton, which is what components will enable people to use a site. And this is where kind of the rubber hits the road in a lot of cases. This is the home of the wireframe. It's the particular elements that you're going to have on each individual page and the layout of those elements and what those elements actually do. And really, in this level of interface design and interaction design, there's 4 key principles that you should keep in mind when you're thinking about your site and developing your site. And these are discoverability, recoverability, context, and feedback. And we're going to step through these in order with some fairly specific examples of how these actually apply when you're developing a website. Discoverability is all about finding things easy. And the first example is a what not to do example. And this is actually something where something from the next level up, the information architecture really breaks down. This is a homepage from ICQ, and there's kind of a cacophony of choices here. And unless you want to download ICQ, it's hard to figure out what else you can do on this page. Or even if you know what else you want to do, it's hard to figure out where to go to figure out how to do it. And compare this to, say, a Blogger homepage, where you come to this page and it's relatively clean and clear, and it's fairly easy to understand coming to this page what it's possible to do. It's possible to get a blog. It's possible to learn about a blog. The user doesn't have to think a lot about how to figure out their way navigating the site. Another example, though, is if you go to Yahoo and you set up a new homepage, this is what you get. Yahoo could have just presented a blank page to users that are setting up a new homepage and let them figure out all the possible things that they could put on that homepage and let them build their homepage. But instead of that, what they do is they provide a picture, a quick picture, a preview. It's clear that it's a preview because it's faded out and it's labeled preview. but it provides a quick snapshot to the user of the type of things that are possible for them to do. It's very easy for them to figure out, oh, I can get AP headlines, I can get weather, I can probably get sports. I can get all this stuff really easily. I just have to figure out how to get it. But the other thing you can do is, here's Old Navy. You can kind of look over the user's shoulder. As the user is mousing over the site, they get a little pop-up box where they can learn more information about a particular set of boxers in this case. And basically, you're kind of peering over your user's shoulder and providing information just in the course of their normal interactions with the site. Another example of this is Faircast. Here, traveling from San Francisco to Boston, I type in the first 3 letters of the word Boston, and I get the 2 potential airports. Once again, just in the course of the normal user interaction with the site, filling out a form, they provide me with information that I need. I don't have to go looking for it. So it's very easy for a user coming to the site to discover the airports that they need to use. The next principle is recoverability, which is the idea that actions should be without cost. And the first example, and once again, some of these examples can straddle various principles. This could also be in feedback. But this is an error message that you get if you fill out a wrong email address. The idea here is there's been a wrong email address entered. You get the form back. It preserves all the information, and there's a clear indication of where to go to fix the error. One way to reduce the cost of actions is to make them cheap. If you want to make it easy to make an error, you want to make it easy to recover from an error. But another example, this is a search-related example, once again a travel example. Say I'm traveling from San Francisco to Boston, and I do this on Travelocity. I enter my search criteria, I click submit, I get this Travelocity interstitial page, I get some blinking lights, and I get the search results back. And here, once I'm on this page, there's some things I can do. I can kind of select only non-stops. I can look at particular airlines. But if I really want to fudge with the search criteria any more than that, I'm really stuck. I have to go and resubmit the whole query and sit through the interstitial page again and watch the blinking lights again and get the new search results. Compare this with Faircast, where this is my initial set of search results. On the fly, I can play with my arrival and departure times. It updates my results on the fly. I can decide that there are certain airlines that I refuse to fly on. And once again, it'll update the results on the fly. It makes changing search criteria really lightweight and really easy. Another, and this is kind of an error example one, if I mistype the word Boston in Travelocity, I get this error page. This is a fine error page. It tells me what I did wrong. It tells me what to fix it. But once again, compare this to Faircast. By typing in BOS and having the information fed to me, it's really hard for me to make an error here. So one way to reduce the cost of errors is to help prevent the user errors in the first place. An example in the same vein is signing up for a Google homepage. As you type in your password, it tells you on the fly if your password is too short, if it's weak, if it's strong. By helping prevent the user making errors, you reduce the cost of errors and reduce the number of errors that users make. And a final 2 examples here I want to throw out there. This is an Amazon.com diamond search page. It has all these sliders. You can adjust criteria on a variety of things, create carat, price, shape. It tells you how many diamonds are in the search results. You click search results. By making search criteria so easy and so lightweight, it really allows you to give your sense of users a sense of play, the sense that they can actually really explore the data, whether it's their data or data that you're providing them, on your site in a way that hasn't been possible before. But the final cautionary note here is MeasureMap had a lot of these date sliders where you could really adjust a lot of criteria on the fly, which is really, really great. But you really have to think hard how you implement the back end of these things. In the old days, you could have built a huge Flash application or JavaScript application that could have bogged down the user's client. But all of these things potentially kick out requests to the back end, and you have to be careful not to architect your site in such a way that these requests or users using your site are going to bring down the infrastructure of your site. The next principle is context, which is providing a sense of time, place, and meaning to your visitors. This can be as simple as at the Amazon.com checkout pipeline. It's very clear when you're here that there's a series of steps, and you know how far along you are in the series of steps and where you have to go. But another example is this is shopping for shirts on the Gap. You select a color. The add to basket button lights up. You click add to basket. It gets added to the basket. In this case, even though we haven't actually reduced the number of steps of adding an item to a cart, we've perceptually reduced the number of steps, and we've allowed the user to maintain their context. They don't go to a shopping cart page and have to look at their shopping cart again and then go click continue shopping to go back to the page they were. They always maintain the context of where they are shopping on the site. Another example, and this is purely informational, Blogger again, coming to this page, even as a user not knowing much about blogs, this page instantly answers 3 questions. What is a blog? What can I do with it? How can I get one? Providing context can be purely informational. And the final principle is feedback, and this is how the system responds. And clearly this can be error messages, and I actually provide this error message because this is an error message that's bad but not horrible, and there's lots of horrible examples out there. But here I've left off some return date. I get this error message back. It tells me I've been bad, and there's no return date. And it's message 1500 and message 1045, and there's no reason for me to know that. That kind of stuff is written to some spec, and it should be tossed off in a log somewhere. Somebody should be paying attention to it, but there's no reason to give the user that kind of information. Provide them clear messages that give them meaning and tell them what they need to do. But the other example, especially with the arrival of Ajax on the scene, is the user sometimes loses the feedback of a page refresh that told them that their action has been acknowledged and changes are actually taking place. And so we have to come up with methods to address this issue. This is from Basecamp. If you add an item to the list, there's the now ubiquitous yellow fade effect. It gets highlighted in yellow, and it fades out after a while. It provides clear feedback to the user that an action they attempted actually took place. But the other part of Ajax is the asynchronous parts. Lots of times users can kick off processes that don't happen right away. It takes some processing on the back end. It's important to provide feedback that processing is actually taking place. And pretty much any Ajax library you use is going to provide a variety of these little feedback widgets and animations for you to use. But the other thing is you can actually provide this feedback to tell a little fib to your users. There's a classic example of Blogger. Blogger, when you set up a new blog on Blogger, it would happen so fast that the customers were having a hard time understanding that the blog really believing the blog had actually been set up. So Blogger actually would spit up one of these progress indicators for a second or so users would get a sense that a change had actually taken place. Netflix had the same problem on the add to queue. It would add it to the queue, and they'd get this pop-up box, and people wouldn't really get that it wasn't a whole new window. So they had to do an interstitial thing where they show up a little box that has a progress indicator, and then it folds down. And the customers actually found that more usable and more easier to understand what was actually going on. But another issue with Ajax is now you can have action at a distance on a site, which can be really great. You can do a change down here, which affects some other part of the page. You can do a change in the middle, which affects multiple parts of the page. The cautionary tale here is, remember you're on the web, and sometimes, depending on how your pages are laid out, you can have a change that takes place below the fold affect something that the user doesn't actually see. So while this can be a great thing, it's important to kind of keep these changes in the same general visual location so that users, if a user makes a change, they still get the feedback that a change has actually taken place.
So our last element is surface, which is what will the finished product actually look like. We've talked a lot about how design is not just a cosmetic pursuit, but it's important to keep in mind that design is also a cosmetic pursuit, and that the way in which that you think about the visual language of your site is really important. So the first principle I want to talk about is the attractiveness bias. And the attractiveness bias sort of roughly states that there's a tendency to see attractive people as more intelligent, competent, moral, sociable than unattractive people. And one of the classic examples of this is the Nixon-Kennedy debate. And what's interesting about this is that people both experience the debate on television in a visual way and also over the radio in an oral way. The people who watched the televised debate felt that Kennedy was charismatic and he was clearly a stronger candidate than Nixon was, whereas those of the people who were listening at home felt that the candidates were roughly equal, and if anything, Nixon was a little bit better on the issues, which sort of shows that there are these very subtle visual decisions that people are making based on perception. So you can take this right into the web space, and there are some really sort of classic, easy, low-hanging fruit ways to think about ugliness online. We've got these wonderful MySpace pages, which I think are fabulous. I actually really love what these people did to the navigation. It's just big and in your face. But when you're sort of thinking about corporate work and products, you want to have some kind of trust that you develop in the minds of your customers. So there was this recent study done by Dr. Gita Linekegaard at Carleton University, where what they found was, and I'm just going to read this quote, it's pretty powerful. Even if a website is highly usable and provides useful information presented in a logical arrangement, it may fail to impress a user whose first impression of the site was negative. And what she's actually speaking, and what they actually found, was that people were making decisions about the trustworthiness of a site in about 1/20th of a second. So they were doing these sort of tests of things kind of going by very quickly. So the important takeaway is that no matter what work you do to make something sort of usable and to tie into the user's needs, it's really important that you do think about the way that you're communicating visually. So I'm not going to do the 1/20th. Jeff Bean, when he talks about that, actually does that exercise and sort of asks you about trust. What I'm going to do is look at two sites that are very similar in a similar space and just a little bit of detail. So we've got two credit union sites. There's one on the left and one on the right. They have kind of the same color palette. They both use this kind of Swiss-ish kind of grid thing going on. But just look at them and ask yourself which one you find to be more trustworthy. And there are probably some initial decisions that you make about it, and this is highly, highly subjective. I mean, I can say which one I think I would rather do business with, and it's probably the one on the left. There's something about the sophistication of the way they've laid things out that it feels more solid to me. I look at things on the right. A lot of this is perfectly fine and acceptable, but there are things that you start to look at that just don't make as much sense. So we've got this guy on a skateboard doing something, and he's kind of goofy, and there's this sort of strange type that's vaguely clunky, and it's about free checking, and I just don't quite understand what all of this message is to me, whereas the people on the left is a little more coherent. But it's important to just kind of think about that personality and that way that you're expressing in those very subjective kinds of ways. So as you think of your product or your site, it is actually really helpful to think of it as having a personality. So if you take a second to think about organizations or companies with whom you have some kind of a feeling, like let's say Apple, what kind of words come to mind? Is Apple slick and elegant, or is it pompous and silly? I mean, there are ways that you react to it, and you've gotten these messages not just through their products, but through their advertising and their sort of multiple touch points, and they've worked very hard to communicate a clear personality. Flickr also does a really great job. They know their audience really well, and so what we're looking at is actually an error page, not like most error pages you see. It's got internet references on it, and it's got this kind of goofy visual stuff. But it's very clear, and it fits really well into the personality of Flickr, which is kind of warm and quirky. But one thing that's important to think about is they're doing it visually, but they're also thinking about the copy and the content and how all those things are working together. So if we look at these two examples, this is, again, this is Kodak EasyShare gallery on the left, and this is Flickr on the right. And they're competing in the same space, and they do a lot of the same things. But they have two really different feelings to them. The one on the left is highly functional. You can organize and create and edit, and there's these very specific things that you can do. And for some people, that's exactly the right kind of personality. Flickr on the right, again, knowing their particular audience, it's more about sort of social networking and sort of fun, and just it has a different emphasis, and that has a lot to do with personality. So sort of thinking about one of the ways that you can express a personality is in the site's visual language, but it can be really, really tricky because it's really subjective. And this is where so many kind of circular debates come out, because I like orange and you like green, and this reminds me of my childhood, and I can't remember why, whatever. This photo is this. There are so many reasons that people sort of react one way or another to visual design. But one thing that you can do that is a little bit less subjective and is, I don't know, I guess I'll say a little more scientific, is that there are very specific techniques you can do to dramatically improve the quality of your visual design and give sort of a sense of order and confidence and sophistication to your work. So I love to recommend books, obviously, but this book, The Non-Designer's Design Book, is the best hour and a half you'll spend. It's a really, really slim volume. It's kind of got some goofy illustrations in it, but it's got really excellent principles about as an introduction to graphic design and visual design. Robin Williams is the author, and what she presents in it is this framework called the CRAP framework. It's a great mnemonic because it's really easy to remember. But the CRAP framework has 4 basic elements. The first one is contrast. So how do different elements of the site sort of relate to each other visually by shape or either sort of by size or color or type weight. The second element is repetition. So taking some kind of an element and then using it repeatedly. So you could say that this is also consistency. So let's say you have a utility navigation on the site and you repeat it throughout the rest of the site in a sort of consistent location. That's one way to think about it. Another way might be in a sort of a visual device that you might use like arrows to indicate bullet points or something, and that you use those things repeatedly. It begins to sort of give a sense of harmony throughout the site and cohesion. Alignment is one of probably the most useful of all of these if you do nothing else. Thinking about how elements on your site and pages are aligned with each other. And a really quick way to start doing this is to just take a site, maybe take a screenshot of it and go into Photoshop and just draw some vertical and horizontal lines and start to understand where people have lined things up. This is a really subtle way of creating a sense of order. When things are kind of out of alignment, there's this kind of chaotic feeling to a page that you can't quite put your hand on. But sometimes if you just draw a vertical line and just start pushing things up against it, your design will just suddenly pop out as a much more clear thing. And the last one is proximity. Proximity is how you start to create groups of elements, not just sort of disparate ones. So I have a little example here of all these things in action. So let's say you can do this with type, and you can do this with shape, and you can do this with other things. But let's just do it with type because it's a little bit easier. So we've got these 3 content elements: web builder, Las Vegas, December. Got a date. So the way that this is organized is how most people will, when they're trying to design and lay out information when they don't really have an idea how to do it, this is a pretty typical way people will do it. They align it along the center axis. They give a lot of space so that you can make sure that they're distinct from each other and there's a lot, they're easy to read. But what this actually does is it forces people to work really hard to understand. They have to read every single line and every single piece of information and then make decisions about what's important and what sort of the hierarchy of all of these things are. So if you apply the four aspects, you might get something more like this. So some of the characteristics. So first, contrast. I've made a decision about Web Builder 2.0 is the most important piece of information, and I've made it larger. I've made the contrast between a larger size and smaller size type. So you've got a little bit of hierarchy. Proximity-wise, I decided that December, the date and the location are more related. So I put them on the same line and kind of put them together. The other thing is I've made the whole thing a unit so that it's all kind of one unit. And the other thing I did was I aligned up along there's a vertical axis on both sides. So it makes like a sort of a tight unit. And in this case, repetition is a little bit more subtle. It's done in the typeface. So it's all the same typeface, it's sort of different weights of it. Yeah. So I think really the takeaway from that is just those little changes can make a huge improvement, and that everyone is capable of doing those. So.
And the final thing we're going to talk about is documentation. And wireframes, which worked so well for so long at a variety of levels during the web development process, for communicating design decisions and design issues, have really fallen apart with the arrival of Ajax, because all of a sudden we're not talking about a whole bunch of discrete individual pages. We're talking about individual pages, each of which can have potentially hundreds of different states. And wireframing, here's a colorful quote from Jeffrey Zeldman, wireframing this just falls apart in this context. There's a couple of solutions that people have tried to come up with. There are no ideal solutions for this yet. Bill Scott from Yahoo, who's kind of the father of the Yahoo Ajax design patterns library, does a combination of Visio stencil kit and some animations, and he does what he calls storyboards, where he kind of illustrates each phase of an interaction through time. There's also, you can do frame by frames. You could use something like this where you have to document some individual item on a page that you really want to document in excruciating detail. This is a drag and drop interaction where you kind of show the change of all the cursors in each individual state. This doesn't work so well for documenting an entire site, but more for just individual elements. The other thing you can do is you can kind of just beef up the current wireframe things in the annotation section. Here we have something where you want to provide some information if a username is already taken. In the annotation section, you kind of clearly show what can happen, what some of the possibilities are, and how that's going to look. But my current favorite, certainly as a developer, is to actually go to a prototype level. And there's actually a lot of stuff you can do here. This can be as simple as just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all on a page. Define some JavaScript variables at the top of the page. And you can actually end up with simple HTML pages that actually appear fairly functional and are really great for communicating design issues that you're having or design decisions. The other example, which can get a little more complicated, we actually had to do this with measure map at one point. If the data that you have to throw around is too complex, we had to do a demo with measure map where the back end wasn't functioning yet, but we still had to do the demonstration. We were far enough along in the development process that our APIs were clearly spec'd out, and we knew what all the URLs for the APIs were going to be. So we generated a whole bunch of data. You could use XML. We used JSON and just put it in the proper place on a web server somewhere, and then pointed a fully functioning front end to that fake back end data. And we actually ended up with a demonstration that looked like it was entirely functional, that was really just based on pre-baked data. And the final thing is just actually having some sort of functional application. Oftentimes, in the course of a development, you actually have some sort of functioning application that's not feature complete, but it's enough to actually have discussions around when you're trying to make design decisions. But the key thing to remember here is the metric is communication. There's a lot of people that spend time trying to figure out what best practices are or what the best solution is. But really, I really encourage people to look at the particular team you're working with and figure out whatever works best for you, use that, and don't feel like you're doing the wrong thing. As long as you guys can clearly communicate, you're doing the right thing. And that brings us to the end. Here's a list of resources that we talked about and our contact information. Please feel free to contact us. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions.
Okay. No questions. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.